So recently you might have heard about Dr. Bret Weinstein's phrase of the Cartesian Crisis. The Cartesian Crisis is inspired by Descartes' method of doubt. And so what Bret Weinstein argues here isn't necessarily the state of doubt that comes from philosophical inquiry. It's more so about the state of distrust, of not knowing what to trust, who to trust, that is coming from people's erosion of trust in institutions that before were seen as being trustworthy. And so before we go on to that, it is important to claim that, at least for me, even if we knew that our institutions were providing, let's say, accurate information, I would still argue that the Cartesian crisis still stands. Because at least for me, the Cartesian crisis is part of the fundamental human condition, which is that we are born as these finite beings and we are exposed to so many different things. I mean, even just the fact of consciousness, right? Which to some extent is the thing in which we have the most direct experience to, but at the same time, it's also the most mysterious thing. So for me, I a lot of times live in this state of Cartesian doubt because life truly is a mystery. So even if we ignore this other part of misinformation, which is being created by troll farms and whatever, the Cartesian crisis still applies. And so going back to Bret's version of the Cartesian crisis, in which he also titles it as the digital dark age, the argument here is that the institutions that we should trust are providing us with wrong information, and perhaps in ways that are intentional, purposely misleading vulnerable people in our society. And so what he argues here, which then becomes an issue, is that from the point in time where you actually stop trusting institutions, this can very quickly grow and just get to the point where you reach the full Cartesian crisis, where you get to the state of doubting your own doubts and you feel completely lost. He uses an interesting analogy, which is sort of driving a car while blindfolded. And so you have no idea in which direction you should go, you have no accurate information, and because you have no accurate information, you can't really make any decisions. And so what happens in such a state is that cynicism may arise. And so this is one of the main points which I would like to address, which is a lot of times people conflate the idea of skepticism and cynicism. And yes, it is true that cynicism may be a natural response to skepticism, because when we don't know something, or when we enter this extremely high state of doubt, it becomes very easy to assume that things are always bad or negative, that the unknown is bad. And so my main talking point here is that you do not need to be like Diogenes the cynic when you are exposed to uncertainty. It is what really needs to happen is that we need to educate people on how to use skepticism as a tool. Because even the word skepticism by a lot of people is seen as a negative term. It is seen as, okay, you don't trust anyone, you don't believe in anything, you're in disbelief. But skepticism is suspending belief. It's essentially the act of suspending belief. And so when you're skeptical, you're waiting for sufficient evidence in order for you to form an opinion. You're withholding your judgment. Of course, skepticism, if taken to its radical form, can somewhat be destructive because it becomes paralyzing. So at the end of the day, we need to do a chess move that takes us out of the darkness and allows us to formulate some idea that will allow us to navigate the world we live in. Another thing that I believe we should take into account, especially when we are talking about misinformation these days and how everything is a deception and we are under control, something we need to ask ourselves is whether this is a recent phenomena or whether this has been present throughout history. Because a lot of times we have the tendency to believe that what we are experiencing as a society is unique to our times. And so with this, I would like to discuss some elements. One of them is to look at how during medieval times and even before that, you had religious institutions, which were, of course, at the top of society, which were trying to oppress scientific discovery. So there was this sort of thought policing. And so these days, you can still argue that to some extent that might be happening. And some people might argue that in certain countries, that is a reality, where there is this sort of thought police, where if you disagree with certain ideas, you will be punished for them. But to the degree that there is misinformation and deception to obtain control and power over people, I believe that this is a long-standing theme in human history. The only difference is that now we have different tools to engage in such deception. But I wouldn't necessarily say that this tendency of deception is greater these days than it was in the past, because as I said in the past, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have all of these tools that are disseminating information. And so in the past, if you were living in a village, you were living in a community, and it was very likely for the people with whom you cohabitated to have very similar opinions to the ones you had, because the geography basically shaped your beliefs about the world. And today, that's not the case. I believe that's the biggest difference, because today, you might be living with your parents, with housemate, whomever it might be. You're living in the same geography. Let's even assume that you were born in the same place and you have around the same education. Even in such a situation where the parameters seem very normalized, it is still very possible for both of you to have diametrically different opinions. And so when you have a polarity of opinions, when you have a lot of different belief systems, we know from the literature that certain problems may arise because people tend to really stick to their beliefs, and we have this tendency to become dogmatic. And when we become dogmatic, we have this very emotional attachment. And we know that emotion is a crucial part of belief formation. Neuroscience covers that perfectly. And so when something coincides with our worldview, and when that thing which is coinciding with our worldview puts it to risk, then we become very defensive. And if you have societies with people with very differing viewpoints and that are very attached to their viewpoints, of course there's going to be conflict. And that attachment can, of course, be weaponized. You can play with people's emotions. You can show them things that they want to see. And so that's sort of what the algorithms try to do to some extent. But we don't even need to go that far. We can just look back. We don't need to go to the medieval ages. For example, in the country where I'm from, Portugal, thought policing was applied extensively until fairly recent, until the 70s, because Portugal was a fascist regime. And so if people thought certain things, they would be imprisoned or worse. And of course, there are countries that still do that to this day. But this is just to show that a lot of the things that we believe that are just a problem of the digital age aren't necessarily specific to these technologies. It might be the case that these technologies are augmenting the dark shadow, our worse aspects, but we can also look at the other side, which is, let's say that you were completely isolated from information sources and you're getting all the information about your world from a priest or some other figure, a guru or whatever it might be. And you really have no access to other perspectives and opinions. You're completely isolated. There's a big asymmetry of information. In that way, it becomes very easy to be manipulated because you're just being exposed to one point of view. And so, although these days there is a lot of manipulation going on online, there's also the case that you are being exposed to many points of view. So to some extent, that allows you to become harder to manipulate. The problem here is that, of course, you can get stuck in echo chambers where you're always just seeing the same type of content You're getting the news always from the same source. And then that very easily becomes your worldview. You're just being shaped sort of by how people were shaped in the old days. For me as an outsider, I sort of see this now with the whole political landscape in the US, where it's extremely polarized. You have people on the left, people on the right, and no matter what one's party is doing, people will just cling to their own ideas. It is very hard to make someone on the right to see worth on the left, and for people on the left to see value on the right. And so this is, of course, very problematic, because one of the essential aspects of skepticism is, like I said, suspending belief, being open to new evidence coming in. And so what I believe is that we need to reshape this problem that Bret is discussing, of this digital dark age, of this age of misinformation that leads us to this horrible place of radical Cartesian doubt. What we need to do is put our skeptical hats on, actually use skepticism as it's intended to be used. You can use it as a way to keep open-minded and sort of adopt the view of having strong beliefs but loosely held. And so at the end of the day, we're going to have our own beliefs. That's inevitable, right? Extreme skepticism is psychologically impossible, let's say, because at the end of the day, we all have our axioms and we operate within them. No one expects us to be perfect. But it is very important to use skepticism correctly and not necessarily see skepticism as something negative, because it isn't. You know, the logic of scientific discovery is based on this idea of getting new information, and if that information is significant, then we readjust our model. As Karl Popper often says, it's this idea that we create new theories that must be testable. And because they're testable, they are to some extent falsifiable. And so we keep on shaping our theories, we keep on improving our models, but we're never necessarily stuck to just one opinion. And so what I want to clarify with this video, I think my main message, is for us to not enter this state of cynicism that everyone is out to get us. I also want to mention that, like I said before, skepticism is not equal to cynicism, and that our attitude to information these days needs to be exactly the same attitude that we would have needed to adopt regardless of what our institutions are doing. So basically the idea is that we need to have information hygiene. We need to look at problems from different viewpoints. We need to be able to steelman our own ideas. So a lot of times it's useful to try to see the flaws in our own beliefs. And of course, all of this takes a lot of information, it takes a lot of effort. And we do not need to do this for everything, but for the things that truly matter to us, I believe that this is a useful thing to adopt. So even in a perfect world, blind trust is never ideal. It truly isn't. Because we should try to avoid to blindly trust an opinion or information just because it comes from a source of authority. Because as I mentioned in previous videos, having a PhD, having a postdoc, it doesn't mean you're immune to error. It just hopefully means that probabilistically you should make less errors regarding your area of expertise. But all of us can be wrong. All of us are human at the end of the day. We're just slightly more intelligent primates. And we tend to forget this aspect. And so don't cling to certainty. The world isn't supposed to be certain. No one is actually owner of the truth. Sometimes we get into this illusion that things are black and white, that they're very simple, and that therefore we must demand from everyone to tell us how things actually are. But that's not the case. We live in a very complex, mysterious universe. And so we need to keep that in mind, regardless of what is going on in these platforms, the misinformation, the bots, the deep fakes, whatever it might be. All of these things have happened just through different shapes and forms in the past. And so let's not allow ourselves to enter this wave of cynicism that is so easy when we go to the internet. Because if you see most interactions, you go on Twitter or you go on other social media, you see a disproportionate amount of people acting like sociopaths or just acting in ways that they wouldn't if they were face to face with you. And so this, of course, then changes our probabilistic perception of how humans actually are. And sometimes I need to think about this, which is that if I spend too much time on social media, I will start getting this idea of how the world is, the idea of how people are, that is, of course, cynical, because you see behaviors that are extremely, antisocial in these social media platforms. And so I then try to think that most people whom I interact, that I see day to day, are really far from that standard of behavior. Of course, you can argue that that's the case because I wouldn't personally be involved with people who acted that way. But the society I see around me, and perhaps this is because in Portugal, we are some 20 years or 10 years behind the US, that some of the issues that I see online, which normally tend to be biased and focused on the US reality, aren't still present here. And so that's something that also tends to happen, which is if we spend too much time online, we start importing other people's problems that we don't actually have. And so you're basically becoming infected by problems that do not match your reality. And this then becomes a very interesting dilemma because culturally you haven't been prepared to the problems you're now importing to your life. And so this is something that we should also be careful, which is that if we spend too much time online, and we know from principle that people act in strange ways online, and we also know that there are a lot of bots that are having these interactions that are made to inflame public opinion, to make people have fights with one another, we need to take a step back and realize that this is not normal behavior, that this isn't how most people actually are. So this once again comes back to internet hygiene, which all of us need to have. And so with this video, I just wanted to, not necessarily, I wouldn't say give an optimistic viewpoint, but I would just like to say that cynicism does not need to be the response to what Bret Weinstein calls the digital dark age. We just need to do better with being skeptical. We just need to take a scientific approach to the things that we are being exposed to. And if we do that, that will allow us to better navigate the society. It will allow us to not become so attached to our opinions, perception, beliefs about the world. And this will actually allow us to have a better understanding that things simply aren't black and white. They're not simple. If you're looking for certainty, you're not going to find it. That's just not the case. Certainty is a very rare thing, right? Taxes are a certainty. But, it's just not a part of the human experience. It never was, Before perhaps you would have other forms of uncertainty, right? You would have predators going around, you would have food uncertainty, shelter uncertainty. A lot of people in the modern world still suffer from that. But, uncertainty will always be present. It just takes on different shapes. And so we just need to be aware of that. And so I would just like to end with the phrase, strong beliefs, loosely held. Thank you.